The work of Horace Ove has always been close to African Odysseys, and throughout the years we've featured many of the films. The films really captured what we were about, and we were also really privileged many times to have Horace share his insight and time with us. And while I am on that note, I would like to say that we've been honoured to have the support of Horace Ove's family in devising and delivering this season of films, documentaries, talks and events. We've been a long time in the planning of this season, as well as the restoration of his debut Pressure before the sad passing of Horace earlier this year. So in addition to today's event, throughout this month we'll be screening the restored version of Pressure from the 1970s, the first Black British drama, and a really seminal piece of film history. On Tuesday we are going to welcome Michael LaRose, son of John LaRose. John LaRose, a great influence on the work of Horace Ove, and also the subject of Horace Ove's film, Dream to Change the World. Michael will share his insight into the roots of carnival culture when we screen King Carnival on Tuesday, and he'll also discuss reggae culture in the UK. Later at the weekend, we're screening a couple of Horace's dramas, including A Hole in Babylon, which is a drama documentary exploring the Spaghetti House siege. All these films have featured in the past African Odysseys programme. So if you are new here, if this is your first encounter with Horace Ove's work, do grab our monthly programme and see what else we have in store. We're going to view a short slideshow, and the slideshow shows images from Horace Ove. Horace Ove was a photographer as well as a film director, and a notable photographer who captured much of life in the 60s and 70s in London and the UK. So we're going to use some of those slides from Horace Ove, and we're going to feature an interview that our host for today, the actor-director Burt Caesar, had with Indra Ove, his daughter. So that will be the soundtrack, and then you'll be looking at some of Horace Ove's great photographs. And what we're going to do is run straight into, so that will be a kind of introduction, and those, I'm sure some of you are new to his work. That will give some sort of context for the film following that, which was made by Horace and features the writer and activist James Baldwin in his prime when he visited London. He visited London with the comedian Dick Gregory, and he met at a students' association. And then finally, following the screening, as I mentioned, actor-director Burt Caesar, who's our host for today, will be joined by some very special guests. A word of, first of all, apologies and quick thanks to Colin Grant, who can't be with us today, but it's his Writer's Mosaic literary project from which we've taken the interview between Burt Caesar and Indra Ove. And if you want to find out more about that, you can explore the Writer's Mosaic on the web. Thanks for listening, and look forward to see you after the films.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again. My name is Burt Caesar. I'm an actor and director. And this is our panel, who I shall introduce with some capsule biographies before we go on. You may know some people already, but these are for people who don't know who's on the panel. Next to me on my left is Donari Yahzid. Donari is a research scholar and activist working in the fields of social justice, land rights, and international development. Though she often works in the Caribbean, South America, and the South Pacific, she currently is working on land rights in the USA, specifically how white nationalist groups impede access to land rights and social well-being for marginalized people. Donari's work challenges assumptions of power and identity across various hegemonic structures to make room for an era in which self-determination is not just the right of one group, but the standard for all. Next to her, Nichole Moore. Rachelle Moore. Is it the French pronunciation? Rachelle.
It is.
Nichole Rachelle Moore is a writer, educator, and the curator of Caribbean collections at the British Library. Her debut collection, Memories, Musings, and Unfinished Conversations, is published at the end of this month. What's the date, Michelle? What's the date it's published? Michelle is your publisher, sorry. What date is it published?
It's actually out. That was just a safe thing. It's actually
okay,
out.
It's available in all good bookstores.
Soon.
Okay. Memories, Musings, and Unfinished Conversations by Nichole Rachelle Moore. And on my far left is Professor Gus John, who has campaigned for racial and social justice and for children's education and their rights since he arrived in the UK from the island of Grenada in 1964. He came to study theology and to become a Catholic priest, starting the first black supplementary school in Oxford in 1966. That same year, he had a watershed meeting with the late John La Rose and New Beacon Books, and joined the seminal Caribbean Artists Movement. I should just say, for those who don't know, New Beacon Books is a kind of literary caravanserai on the Stroud Green Road in North London. A bookshop.
One of the best descriptions we've had. It's one of the best descriptions we've had.
Can I copyright it?
Yeah.
It's probably the oldest independent bookshop in the UK. And upstairs is the George Padmore Institute with archives about black social action and literary events for the last 50 years. That same year, 1966, when Gus had the meeting with John La Rose, he was also an attendee at the West Indian Student Center, which we saw in the film, and we'll talk about some more. So Gus is a scholar activist, a Pan-Africanist, a writer who has just published 2 very timely books, Blazing Trails, Stories of an Heroic Generation, a portrait of, how many people, Gus? How many?
22.
22 post-war Caribbean people in Britain. They comprise obituaries, eulogies, and portraits. That's Blazing Trails, Stories of an Heroic Generation, and Don't Salvage the Empire Windrush. Both books are essential correctives to the absurd and lazy historical branding that the British state is so keen to mark we Caribbeans and others with. That last sentence is mine, not Gus's. We're going to have a conversation for about half an hour or so, and then we'll open to the floor for 20, 25 minutes of Q&A. But before we start conversing, I want to do a little straw poll with you, the audience. Those of you who have seen Baldwin's Nigger before tonight, can you raise your hand? So, who's good at maths, geometry? About a quarter. I know the people whose hands are raised, how many of you are seeing it? I've seen it more than once, including this afternoon. How many? So very, very few. So let me ask the $24,000 million question. Who has seen it for the first time? Can you raise your hands, please?
Wow.
Thank you. So in a way, my first bowl to you, starting with you, Donari. can you just share with us what your reaction was when you first saw this film? Just give us a sort of sense of the visceral, emotional, as Baldwin might have said, what did the flesh tell you? What did the flesh, how did it speak to you when you first saw this film?
I think the first time I saw it, I was going off the title, so Baldwin's Nigger. I was tense going into it because I didn't know if that title would mean that he was claiming himself as an object or if he was reclaiming the word for his own use. And someone as big and, in a sense, powerful as Baldwin is, it's so easy to link what he says as truth, but not just truth for himself, truth for the Black idea and the Black nation, Black people. So though he is an incredible person, I didn't want him to necessarily speak for me. And in actually watching the film, I loved how he was there and he was presenting, but he was a man speaking of his own experience. And the people in the audience really, really challenged him. They weren't taking what he said as gospel by any means. The idea of Blackness was being democratized in a way and being built from scratch. It was being taken down. We see Baldwin, what I think of, get a bit defensive when he's asked, why do you consider yourself an American Negro and not a Black man? That is a personal experience. And I loved that so much more than I imagined I would. And I loved that the audience had the confidence to confront him as a man and not as an idea, not as a Black man, in a sense. Yeah.
Nichole?
Yes. I wasn't tense. I don't actually remember the first time I watched this film. It was quite a while ago, the first time, and of course more recently. I never went into it, the word nigger didn't sort of like ruffle my feathers to any extent. But yeah, I mean, I went into it this time around, the couple of times that I watched it recently, just kind of keeping in mind that Baldwin, I mean, like other sort of thinkers, writers, sort of leaders, we think of them sometimes unfairly as kind of like the oracle. And I really take Donari's point that the audience does not see him like that. And in fact, it's Baldwin who says in his essay, Dark Days, that the irreducible price of learning is realizing that we do not know. And I think that he speaks so eloquently for such a time during this film, but there is never that sense that he has all the answers. And of course, the audience gives him, Caribbean people. He kind of got... he had to he wasn't on the ropes at all, but, I think it was really good, the engagement.
Gus?
I think I first saw the film in the early 1970s. It was very evocative for a number of reasons at a number of levels. I had been concerned for some time, from a fairly early age actually, as to where this peculiar name John came from, which my father had imposed upon him at some point. My mother's maiden name was Hines. My grandmother's name was Louison. I didn't detect anything particularly African in any of those. And so I came to understand the relationship between those names and how we came to be in Grenada as African people. That's at one level. At the other level, I grew up with the Roman Catholic Church 300 yards from our house, But to the left of our kitchen, which was not in the same building as the house, was a Shango tent. So Roman Catholicism and the Orisha tradition of the Yoruba people of West Africa were always in contestation. But the drums of Shango resonated with me more than the dribblings of the Roman Catholic priest. So I had to sift all of that as I was growing up as a boy. And my mother was a staunch Roman Catholic, and she got me operating as an acolyte from the age of 6. So I had to listen to a whole heap of drivel from one priest after another, while trying to make sense of my place in the world and all that stuff that was going on around me. So that is the second level. The third level really is this. I had started doing theology with the Dominican Order in Oxford in 1964, a couple of months after arriving in this country. And throughout that period, I was really interested in what was happening in the United States. Riots, Watts, New Jersey, Detroit, all over the place. And in many ways, the film helped me to place that in perspective, as well as Baldwin as a man who himself had been a preacher pretty much at the same age when I started going into pulpits in Grenada. And reading his work and how his attitude towards Christianity informed his writing, well, the contestations he had with Christianity, I could identify with that to a very large extent. I mean, I don't want to go on forever, but just one anecdote. In the third year of my studies, I had to write a thesis, a topic of your choice. And I decided, somewhat audaciously, I would say, to have as the subject of my thesis an understanding of man, an understanding of what it means to be human, is a fundamental prerequisite to an understanding of the concept of God. Now, the theologians thought I was completely balmy. Everybody thought that was starting the other way around. But by then, I had arrived at a position where I thought not only that most religion was just pure humbug, but that Christianity particularly had such a role in the enslavement of Africans and the erasure that accompanied that in terms of our genealogy, our spiritual practices, and what have you, that if we were not focused on human liberation, subsuming under that African liberation, women's liberation, whatever else it may be, then we've totally lost the plot. And to be focused upon human liberation, you didn't need religion, let alone Christianity. So I was enthralled by James's writings and the way these themes recurred over and over again in the stuff that he wrote.
Do either of you have any of that Christian background or a background in a faith that you can relate to Baldwin's own kind of questioning, self-questioning, and so on? Donari?
I'm not Christian. I grew up as a Rastafarian, and I didn't grow up in a religious context, but more so as a cultural context. Rastafarianism, in its way, comes from a sect of very early Christianity, but how it's practiced today is, how Christianity is practiced today and how Rastafarianism is practiced is very, very different, so no.
But you both have the King James Bible as the source.
It depends who you speak to, but not really.
Nichole?
Yeah, so I was brought up as a Catholic. I went to St. Joseph's Convent in San Fernando in the south of Trinidad, so it's seen as one of the best girls' schools on the on the island, that kind of thing. Yeah, I didn't think about contestation before with me, but I know that at an early age I said to my mother I wasn't going anymore to what do you call it, confession. Yeah.
You had no guilt to kind of absolve
Well,
you.
I said, what was I doing that was so bad? I was thinking, and having to make things up in the, in the confessional box. It was just ridiculous. We used to have to go to church every Tuesday, the school, and you have to confess. I just found it really ridiculous. And my mother would say things like, well, it's a club, and there's certain rules. And then as I got older, I told her something one day that meant that she never asked me to go to confession again. I wasn't rude. It was just a truthful thing, but about her not sticking to rules. But but always, as Gus was saying, the Shango tent, the Shango drums were right there. Like we had cousins and so on who were spiritual Baptists, and we always knew people who were part of the Ifa Orisha tradition. So, and really, as Baldwin says in the film, the Christianity that African Americans, that he knows, the Christianity that they're practicing, that they're living, is not the Christianity that white Americans, so-called white Americans, are practicing and living. And so in that way, I really understand that, because in Trinidad, Catholics would go to what would be called loosely the Obia man or Obia woman, and no problem. There's no kind of confusion in your head about, oh God, I'm saying the rosary, but I'm going to, to consult and to have divination and all of that. Yeah, different kind of practice. So yeah.
It's interesting how just hearing Baldwin speak, you can't but see how much his oratory is rooted in the church.
Oh, for sure.
And there's also one of his most fascinating and remarkable essays, which I try to read as often as I can, there's so much subtext in it. It's called A Visit with a Northern Protestant, 1963. He would define himself, although he was born in Harlem, as a Southern Protestant, a Pentecostalist. And the Northern Protestant was Ingmar Bergman, the filmmaker.
Okay.
And he loved Bergman's early films. The Virgin Spring, Seventh Seal, Wild Strawberries. And what he saw in Bergman, the Northern Protestant, was someone who was brought up in a very austere Protestant tradition, rejected it at some point in their lives, but spent the rest of their time on earth fighting this kind of tradition that had made them. And they were trying to kind of disagree with and know what they can take from it, what is good, what works. In a sense, it was kind of pitting reason against faith. And I suppose, Gus, that's something which you has faced in your own kind of practice and life.
Indeed, perennially, frankly. One of the reasons why I left the Roman Catholic Church and jumped out of the cloth, so to speak, was that I couldn't square what the church represented and what it was doing and had done historically. The church does not know what non-repetition means, right? So all that stuff that went on during enslavement continued. I couldn't understand, for example, why the Dominican order, of which I was a member, a religious order, had houses in Stellenbosch and Witwatersrand in South Africa, where I couldn't visit. I was one of 19 in the cohort that joined in my year. We were doing theology, Balliol, wherever, as everybody else. But when the dean came over from Stellenbosch to visit us at Blackfriars in St. Giles in Oxford, they were having a conversation as if I wasn't even in the room, as the only black person. And that was a good preparation for what was going to happen in the rest of my life. the only, and the way you treat it as the only. And I asked certain questions about how the Roman Catholic Church was dealing with the systemic structure of apartheid, and it just did not make any sense. But in addition to that, the church was also underwriting, giving divine absolution to tyrannical rulers all over the place. Franco, Salazar in Portugal, and so on. And there I was coming out of an experience as the descendant of enslaved Africans, joining this monolithic entity that was constraining people in every possible way. And I just wanted to break out of all of that. I mean, the idea that I could have thought that I would survive one day as a priest, I think, was just fanciful, right? So I just broke out of all of that completely, because it seemed to me that it was a structure that dehumanized. It was a structure that turned people against one another. So in a small country such as Grenada, in a small village such as mine, where there were less than 250 people, the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church were always vying for our attention and our loyalty.
Your soul.
For our souls. But at the same time, pitting people against one another. So if my aunt decided that she was going to marry somebody in the Anglican Church, the priest was telling me that I couldn't go to the wedding, I couldn't set foot in the Anglican Church because they're Anglicans. Now, what foolishness is that, right? So it just did not make any sense. There was nothing human about it. It erased humanity. And so while I remained deeply spiritual, I have absolutely nothing to do with organized religion.
You know, those kinds of hypocrisies are what Baldwin himself forced him to leave the Pentecostal church, where he was a preacher from the age of 13.
Sure.
But
it's what I call ontological dislocation.
It's a nice, any students out there, it's a nice phrase to put in your essay. That's 10 marks there. One of the things, though, that watching the film now for the fourth or fifth time, I get a strong sense of Baldwin being very much a man alone, in the sense that in his period, in the 60s, the other great orators that we know of, I mean, we had, of course, MLK Jr., Martin Luther King, but he had the Baptist Church behind him. You had Malcolm X early on. He had the Nation of Islam behind him. You had H. Rap Brown, Stokely Carmichael. They had the Black Power movement behind them. Baldwin had none of those kind of mass movements. He was very much an independent voice. He was a writer who was an accidental activist in a way. Nichole, when you write, and writing is a very solitary, very kind of a lonely experience in many ways. Do you ever think about, like when you have to sell your books, you got to do public appearances, how does that kind of public-private thing work? And in a way, I feel like Baldwin had activism and being a spokesperson thrust upon him because of the times you're in. But as a writer, how do you feel about having to confront being a public persona?
Okay, so first of all, this is my debut collection, so I haven't gone on to the hurly-burly of all of the public stuff yet. But I mean, I've spoken publicly in other spaces and spheres. I think that Dick Gregory in the film describes Baldwin as a social writer. At some point when he's speaking, he describes him as a social writer. And I expect that in that time, as in now, there's no way that you can be writing some of the essays that Baldwin has written and was writing and not be then asked. You know that you're going to be asked to say something publicly, to speak some of those writings publicly. I mean, when Baldwin, watching him in the film, I was kind of thinking, I don't know if anybody else was, I was thinking, did he write anything down? I mean, did he prepare anything? It was just like coming, I'm like so in awe, like it was just like coming out. But I think that one of the things that I feel strongly is that if you are speaking a truth, you don't have to change your story too much. You know, if you're speaking a truth, you speak your truth. If you're speaking the truth through your writing, or if you're then asked to speak publicly, you don't have to, you know, fudge around and change it up. It remains to be seen.
Any thoughts on that thing of that public-private push-me-pull-you thing?
I do not have any books, so I've not had to ever do a press tour about something I've written or said or anything of the sort. But I feel that writing in general, for anybody who writes anything, is a very personal experience. And to put yourself on paper is a very big step. For then somebody to consume you, and you don't know how they will take you, is another very big step. And then to stand in front of the people who have consumed you in some type of way and have them talk directly to you is a massive step. That all of these take a lot of humility and a lot of kind of coming back to yourself and understanding that it is me, but I'm choosing to share this to the world. And when I see Baldwin, I never really saw him as alone, though that's a very good point. But I saw it more as you have to be very brave to put yourself out there the way that he has, and for it to pay off so much that today we speak about him. Forever we'll probably speak about him. And that comes from, like you said, truth. If you put truth out there, it will last forever. And the ability to put truth out there is incredibly hard, but is incredible.
I think also we have to remember the age in which Baldwin was writing, 60s, 70s, well, I mean 50s onwards. And the contradictions that he had to confront, particularly in relation to his sexuality. So he was a young preacher. He was trying to understand all sorts of stuff to do with the individual as believer, dogma and doctrine, and how he made sense of his world in what was clearly and remained for him a very hostile environment because of his sexuality, because of other people's attitudes towards his sexuality. And so that for him, the oppression of race and what black people were experiencing in the United States was compounded by all the discrimination, prejudice, and the risks that he had to take as a gay black man. So I think in terms of his positioning, as he looked at himself and his being in the world, so to say, it required a huge amount of introspection, which clearly he was very good at, but also trying to, as honestly as possible, interpret the world or interpret America to itself. One of his, before I even read Go Tell It on the Mountain, I read The Fire Next Time, and that helped me to understand a huge amount of the position of black people in American society and what America was doing around the world. So we have to see him holistically, especially in terms of that contestation between religion, Pentecostalism, and homosexuality.
It's interesting, those kind of internal crises or struggles. As I said in the program, I played the role of Meridian in the British premiere of his play Blues for Mr. Charlie.
Yes.
It's like a Greek drama, written for the Actors Studio originally, directed by Burgess Meredith, who from my childhood. I remember he played the Penguin. Was it the Penguin he played? Yeah. And the great Al Freeman Jr. The late great Al Freeman Jr. played the part that I played, Meridian. But there's a scene where Meridian's son, Richard, who has gone to New York to be a pop star, to be a soul star, has discovered fame and has come back to the South and decided, I'm going to just reject this kind of colored water fountain, white water fountain. I'm a big star in New York. I'm going to do what I want to do. And of course, he is killed. The opening line of the play is a white man with a sack saying, may this nigger, like every nigger, die face down in the weeds. And he throws the sack into the bayou. And the play works back to that moment. But Richard's father, Meridian, who I played, and his girlfriend go down to the South to try and find out what happened to their boyfriend and their son. And at one point in the play, Meridian, the father, realizes he's falling in love with his son's girlfriend. And he has a line where he says, do you feel what I feel? And it only made sense as I rehearsed and performed. I thought, there's something in here about Baldwin talking about his kind of things which are kind of, you can feel and think about, but you can't avow too publicly. It was a really interesting, it took me very late to get to it, but I suddenly realized that was subtly included in all his work, actually. He touches on these things. But I want to grab the nettle of this N word, so-called. As you know, the BFI has had huge trouble. I mean, I don't understand it myself. You know, he was Baldwin's nigger. I mean, he explains, it's a descriptive phrase. But having seen the film a few times, I've often been sort of struck by, I wish I could see more of Dick Gregory. The reason being, the first time I saw it, I'd never heard of Baldwin, really, but I heard of Dick Gregory. One of the reasons being, he'd published in 1964, I think, his first autobiography, which was called Nigger. And it was dedicated to his mother. And the dedication said, Dear Mama, wherever you might be now, if ever you hear the word nigger again, remember they are advertising my book. And that kind of droll undercutting of ignorance, of prejudice, of nonsense. The word nigger, it's part of a history. It's understood, as Baldwin explains, it's to do with history. Do you want to just riff on that, Gus? That whole notion of history and naming, what a powerful thing naming is. The fact that, for instance, at the Great March on Washington, 1963, I Have a Dream, etc., all those speakers talked about the Negro. But written down, it had a capital N, an uppercase N. Back in the day, in the 19th century, it was a lowercase n. But you can't hear the uppercase n in speech. But this whole thing of naming and how history has kind of sold us all of these attempts to name ourselves and claim agency over our identity. And Baldwin, in a sense, was speaking to that.
It's a complex issue and one that I have tried to address in some of my writing. Just to give you an anecdote, I was asked by BBC, whatever program it was, to come and comment on, I think, the killing of somebody or other by the police. They called it death in custody, which I disavow. And I started telling Richard Elms, it was, that part of my journey as an activist was dealing with people whom I call domestic terrorists, who were never proscribed by the state and who were never called that by the state. Those who used to go and put petrol bombs into Asian people's houses and incinerate them in their beds, or kill Anthony Walker and Stephen Lawrence and so on and so forth. And what I was saying is that we went through a period where there was Paki bashing and nigger hunting. The fellow nearly dropped off his seat, clearly and said, we do not use such language on the BBC. So I said to him, whether you use such language on the BBC or not, it's a historical fact that people used to go nigger hunting. And he shut me down completely. What I was trying to say is that we have to situate what the police were doing at that time in the wider context of systemic racism on the part of the state and its immigration legislation and what have you, and the culture of racism that the society generated and sustained. So that when police officers used to get up in Brixton Police Station, put their helmets on, stick the batons in their trousers, and nonchalantly announce to their peers in some open plan office, we are going nigger hunting, without irony, without anybody protesting. That's what they did. So then, if you relate that to Swamp 81, which caused the 1981 uprisings in Brixton, or to Stop and Search and the abuse of police powers in Stop and Search, or for that matter, police deaths, police killings in custody, you then get a historical sense of how all of those things add up. I do not know to this day whose sensibilities are being protected when you sanitize history in that way and tell me that I can't talk about what the police used to do in Brixton.
Yes. Donari, just in terms of generation, I turn to you not as a spokesman for your generation.
Thank you.
But with your experience, parental experience, Trinidad, Jamaica, living in Ghana, coming through Rastafari, living in America, how does the word nigger sit with you and you think a wider generational kind of cohort?
So I think that the only place that I expect to hear the term nigger is in the US. And when I hear it anywhere else, I'm always taken aback. And not for the reasons of it is anything to be ashamed of, because like we've all understood, it is not our word. It's not something to degrade me, because I am not degraded by somebody else's imposition of me. And the day, exactly, sticks and stones. I guess my generation, and everybody takes to the word differently. So if you want to understand yourself, not as a nigger with an ER, but as a nigger, and you want to do that for yourself, who am I to say yes, no, maybe so? It's you, it's your identity, it's your belief. Do what you would like. And I think a lot of people in my generation have taken time to reclaim the word, if it makes sense for you. Growing up, my family is Jamaican and Trinidadian. I was never taught to refer to myself as a nigger, Negro, anything of the sort. And in America, when I was going to school there, friends of mine would refer to themselves as that, but never refer to me as that, just because it's not how I walk through the world, but it is how they do. So it's a choice. It's part of your identity. You get to now create it in your own way. But I think the most important part of it is that in it being reclaimed, it is now, in a sense, Black people who get to determine who gets to use it. Because in this theater right now, I can assure you certain people are not going to use the word.
True.
And others will. And that isn't necessarily from the history that it stems from. It's from a change of that history. To be like, you might have planted a seed, but we are taking it over, and we will determine how far it grows and how it does. So there's power to that.
We must also remember Baldwin, who was born in 1924, his centenary is next year. His grandfather and grandmother were enslaved. So when he talks about, my mother, my ancestors were Baldwin's nigger, he's not talking about ancient history. He's talking about 2 generations away, Nichole, do you want to have a riff on that? Before we go to the audience? I
Yeah.
haven't forgotten. Is there Q&A?
They're all here. Nobody's left yet, I don't think. So similarly, you know, there would be people, when I was a teenager, and Trinidadians, you know, Trinidadian teenagers trying to, the whole kind of hip-hop, you know, it came in and so on. So that word with an A at the end, so nigger with an A at the end was the thing, and some people would refer to themselves, and you just used to look at them and think, what are you trying? You know what I mean? You're Trinidadian, you know. But anyway, so yeah, the reclaiming of the word, again, as Donari said, for me, if people want to use that word to describe themselves or whatever, that's fine. That's not necessarily at all, in fact, it's not at all how I've ever described myself. I remember reading a really interesting interview with Samuel L. Jackson, and it was an interview in Essence magazine, in which he talked about, it was just before Barack Obama would have been going for a second term, and he spoke about how that word nigger is used and how, as an African-American man, he uses it comfortably and freely in his circle, and it's sometimes a term of endearment, sometimes it's a term of admonishment, and so on, you know, all the kind of levels. My colleague sister who's in the audience, Nadia Joseph, and I, we, as Education Through Culture, we were asked to speak to young women as recently as, was it earlier this year? The start of this year, at one of the universities, one of the campuses in London. And one young woman was talking with us, you know, within the kind of conversation. It was like a woman's hut or something. I don't remember all the stuff now. But anyway, one of the women was saying that a colleague of hers at work called her a nigger, and he happened to be African himself. He was, I can't remember which country he was from, and she may have been Kenyan. And he called her nigger, and she spoke about how it made her feel. And he said, oh no, but that's, you know, we're both Africans, we can, but she said it made her feel terrible. And so Nadia and I were having the discourse, or about to, or had just started, and the use of the word nigger, and we were shut down totally by the organizer, by the university. We do not use that word here. We do not use that word. And I don't know if she said that it could be triggering, but we were totally shut down, like you're not even supposed to have a conversation about. I mean, I doubt very much that person from the university would be here today. I mean, the title of the film alone, she would have been, she's probably in her bed. So, you know, I think it's about how you stand in your kind of agency around how you want to use the word or not. And I think I always kind of say that the monkey knows which tree to climb. We say this in Trinidad. So I think that there are people like your peers, they know not to use that word to describe you or to kind of hail you out. Similarly with mine when I was growing up and certainly now. But there's no judgment. I mean, use it as you will.
Yeah, I would like to open it now to any questions from the audience. And I say stress questions. I would ask you, please, because of time, if you could treat your questions more like a penalty taker at football. Sorry about these sporting metaphors. A very concise and sharp run-up, and then you whack the ball to these goalkeepers here, as opposed to running the full length of the pitch and then hitting the ball, which could take a little while. So can I have the first two questions, please? The first two. There's one here, and any other hands I can see? One microphone here, and is that a raised hand I see? And just for the sake of transparency, could you just give us your name before you ask your question? Thanks.
Okay, my name is Luke Daniels. And it's going to be a quick goal. Woke. What's your take on woke?
Woke? Like you are woke?
No. Okay, we know that they're trying to shut down discussion in a kind of way on issues like, you know, you use the N-word that you use in there, and other people will try and shut you down, or not only that word, but any discussions that will be challenging for the status quo, as it were. And you must know about woke. You know, that's the word that's being used all the time. You woke if you try to talk about socialism or working class or something like this. You know, you shouldn't, historically,
To
you
talk
shouldn't.
about history, talk about black history, yes.
You're making me
Yes.
take the ball now, sir.
Anybody who wants to be the goalkeeper for that one?
I mean, didn't the word itself kind of come out of America? And it was about consciousness, and it was about, being kind of awake and alert to, dealing with issues of social inequality, social justice, and that kind of thing. I mean, I know in some ways it's become over here, people have taken it and run with it, and in some contexts it's seen as people who are like really kind of precious. So the person at the university who kind of shut us down, for some people she would be seen as being really woke and kind of saying, we don't use that word here, we can't, I mean, a young man once asked me if I was black conscious. I kind of laughed my head off. Poor boy. He was trying to ask me out, and he asked, "But are you black conscious?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." And I'm half. I guess I'm woke. Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, I think words get taken. And they get used politically with a small p. And they can be quite expedient for some people's purposes and some people's agendas.
I mean, very quickly, I think it's a stupid word used in stupid context more often than not. It is used interchangeably with PC, political correctness, and what have you. And it's just being appropriated by some commentators who not only don't know what they're talking about, but they're concentrating on foolishness.
Good. Whoa.
Donari, are you woke?
She's up. She's up.
Yeah, kind of going along with what is said. Once you title yourself one thing or another, you're taking on a lot, and it's best, whatever woke means to you, if it just means that you are knowledgeable about the world or you're not afraid to question what seems incorrect, then be those things and just be, and you don't have to title yourself as woke, politically correct, black conscious, whatever. Just be, and whatever it is, it will show.
I think we're talking about all of this, and I keep remembering the line from Baldwin, that the price of learning, the irreducible price, is realizing that we do not know. That's also being woke, realizing that we do not know. Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, particularly with Gus, who has been a teacher, I'm wondering if he has any comments about his experience in schools, which might be different because I'm white.
Well,
Does anybody want to respond to Gus? I think the question was asked to you as a former teacher.
that takes us into another territory, and I could keep you here for the next hour and a half on that, but I won't. I'll take it as a comment. I want to return to the question that Josephine asked about teaching and the use of that word in that context. I think we need to remember that I talked earlier about a culture of racism and how that manifests. About 18 months ago, I was brought right back to where I had been in Oxford in 1966, taking on some head teachers there because of the treatment that black children were having. When my own 10-year-old granddaughter came home confused and upset because in her class that afternoon, a young boy, white, same age, had got up and announced boldly to the class that from now on we should all call Faith nigger. Primary school, year 6 or whatever it was, the teacher's reaction was simply to say to him, stop being so silly. End of conversation. All right? Now, what is the point that I'm making? I'm saying that word and others like it, we don't hear people talking about coons very much anymore, or nignogs. But I grew up at a time when there was a lexicon with all of that stuff being used liberally. MPs these days use a more sanitized kind of language, including those neo-fascists who are in government right now. But we have to remember that part of the purpose of schooling and education is to assist children now in understanding what went on before, placing it into its proper historical context, understanding how that now feeds into the present and the culture that they are now a part of, and what, therefore, they must prepare themselves to do to change that in the future. It's the whole Sankofa model, in other words. If teachers are not conscious of that and haven't got the confidence or the cultural competence and the sensitivity to challenge behaviors, not in a way that beats people over the head with some blunt instrument, but enables them to understand, as kids growing up, socialized into a racist culture, where that language comes from, why it is oppressive, and how they themselves have got to take personal responsibility for eliminating it, then the schooling system itself is perpetuating this nonsense. And that's what I would say to you.
Can I take the gentleman's question?
Wait, can we answer?
Sorry.
No problem. I just, to your point really quickly, but I do want to get to yours. To the teacher, I remember when I was in high school and the term nigger was in a book that we were reading, and I went to a predominantly white school. When people went around to read their passage, nobody said the word except for me, and people were very shocked and dismayed of like, how could she say that? And the truth of the matter is, again, I have nothing to be ashamed of about the word. It is not mine. And if you are uncomfortable by it, that's your business, but it also is part of your history as much as you think it is a part of mine. In that context, though, nobody else said it, even though I said it, and I was free and fine to, go on about my business. But if other people, or if other, particularly white students, went about saying it, I think it is for the teacher to hold themselves accountable for what happens within a classroom. And that if your students are not, it's not necessarily about equality. If one person gets to say it, we all do. That's not truth in the matter. If it comes up in your classroom and your students aren't aware as to why this is not an equality game, why it's not for everybody's use, and if you know the why, that's probably a great time to speak to your students as to what's actually going on here. There's a larger history in this, and you should be aware of this before we start talking about, we're all students. We should all be able to say it, because we shouldn't. Mm-hmm. So there's context to that should be explained. Mm-hmm. And to your point, the Trinidadian man, he could be white. He may not be, though. We have white Trinidadians, we have white Jamaicans, but he also might just be very light. I'm not too sure if he was white or not. But in the film, kind of Baldwin's take on white liberals, we don't want them, which at times I think is confused with white people, we don't want them. And I think that's a very dangerous mindset. And we should probably look more to what Dick Gregory is saying about whiteness and understanding blackness, not as a color, but as an idea of self and understanding and attitude. Yeah. That's the most important thing. Mm-hmm. And Baldwin says at one point that he's in a position where he's trying to trace back his history and understand himself in a way that a white person is not capable of doing. And that's incorrect. Because if you choose to do that history on yourself as a black person, you can also choose to do that history on yourself as a white person. And there is no slave without a slave master. We are not siloed by any means. So if I want to do the work for myself, and anybody, we also shouldn't get into this understanding of there's just black and there's just white. There are so many people and human beings, all who have done incredible wrongs and incredible rights. And what stands between us is not necessarily our skin tone. It can be, if we let it. It can be our history, if we let it. But there are people who go out of their way to try to question who they were brought up to be, whether it was history, whether it's day-to-day life. And that kind of work on oneself is important for everybody, because even this idea of superiority, white superiority, that is not factually based. That doesn't really stand on anything. And when that crashes, as Baldwin says, you're not doing us a favor by being part of this liberation movement. And we are not poor black people waiting to be saved by any other race or even ourselves. We are helping you out, and you are helping us. We're trying to save the world, each other, humanity.
But I want to jump in and just say that I think that
Very briefly.
Yeah, that when Baldwin was saying that, he was also saying, when he was saying that he was has the advantage because black people, and he wasn't just speaking about himself, that examination and so on, in a way that white people do not. He wasn't saying in a way that white people cannot, but in a way that they do not in that America that he's speaking about, that America that is kind of sleepwalking with this idea of whiteness. I think that's really important.
That sequence in the film had me thinking about the relationship between that discourse at that time about white liberalism and what is now very much in fashion, embraced no less by black people, the notion of white allyship.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Allyship has entered the lexicon in recent times, and again, I've written about that. It's equally problematic for very similar reasons. We don't have time to explore that just now, but it's for me a rather suspect concept. Some time ago, a number of colleagues, academics, wrote an open letter to, I can't remember who the Secretary of State for Higher Education at the time was, basically arguing that there should be some funds set aside to work and ensure that universities are compliant with equality legislation. And then in that same letter, they talked about needing to galvanize the activities of white allies to make that happen. And it seems to me that that's so wrong-headed for all kinds of reasons. It eschews notions of power, privilege, your situation as white people, and the fact that in your institutions, because the society validates white people automatically, you come from a position of power to be my ally. Even if you show no signs of doing something to dismantle the institutional racism that constrains me. So it's, okay, some people might like it and believe that, being neighborly and all of that stuff. But for me, it's a particularly dangerous concept. And I'd like to see white academics, especially, dismantle the master's house by themselves before they come and assist me to do it.
There's only time for one more question, which I have to give to the gentleman who raised his hand.
My name's Nathaniel. I think my question's slightly more geared towards the ex-Catholic priest, but I guess everyone can answer this. So you talked about the idea of obviously Christianity being used as a tool to enslave Africans. Is there any merit, in your opinion, in the deconstruction of the religion itself, especially in terms of self-empowerment? Because the crux of the matter is it's a religion that was used to enslave people, but the religion's not owned by Europeans themselves. The roots of the religion, even the early Christian religion, goes back even before the Near East to East and West Africa. If you look at key tenets and key philosophies of how to live.
So what's the question? Give us the sharp point of your question, please.
That was my question. I said, do you think there's any merit in deconstruction rather than the resistance of a religion that was preached to enslave a people, given that so many of the tenets and beliefs actually go back to Africa?
Okay. We're going to have to be very, very brief and very kind of... Give us the chapter headlines, Gus. Not the full paragraphs.
Thanks for the question. It's an important one. Let me just say this. I mentioned Christianity. As far as enslavement and the role of religion within all of that is concerned, I would also mention Islam. I think one has to, if you're going to be true to history. Every empire across history has perpetuated itself on barbarism, right? The British Empire was God knows, the British Empire was no exception. Barbarism went with the terrain, and it enabled all kinds of things to happen, including genocide. So it wasn't so surprising that, having gone through that particular history, they did what they did in Palestine in 1947 and 1948. The British state knows a lot about evil. Okay. What is the connection between that and the argument about Christianity? It is this, that if you have a system based on dogma and belief, and people are encouraged to imbibe and endorse that, so their values, etc., are based upon your dogma and belief. And if there are total contradictions within that, so that you profess one thing, but institutionally you do and you represent something else, then it means that you are being as complicit in barbarism and in erasure and all of that stuff as anybody else. I don't believe that it is possible to decolonize Christianity, right? I have a go at decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing educational institutions. I don't think I would want to even set myself the task of decolonizing Christianity, all right? Okay, so what that means is, if you're a Christian, get on your knees and ask God to make you the best Christian you can be.
That's a good point.
And that means dealing with oppression and understanding that you cannot stand up for Jesus unless you stand up for justice.
True. Well spoken. Thank you, Gus. Sorry to be harrying you so. I want to end on a note, which is a very poignant note. At the beginning of the event, you heard a snap of a conversation between Horace's daughter, Indra, and me. Now, Indra is here in the audience, yes? Indra? Where you be? There you are. I would just like at the end of this afternoon for Indra, again, Indra, sorry about the time, you have 2.5 minutes and 37 seconds. Can someone get a microphone to Indra, please? Just to give us a riff on, the legacy of your dad's film, and just a sense of the friendship which was forged between Horace and Jimmy, and anything you want to say, like I said, within a little sort of tiny window.
Yeah,
thank you.
I'm quite pleased it's tiny, but asked me to speak on this. But this film, Horace made Baldwin's Nigger in 1967, which was the year I was conceived, so there's not a lot I know of precluding this time, except that this was a very active political time. Horace was very much involved with the Black Power movement. Where I was born, Michael X lived upstairs from us in a flat upstairs. So a lot of the Black Power movement meetings happened in our flat downstairs and in our garden. It was a very, very active time. Burt was asking me how Horace knew Jimmy and how we knew he was coming to speak. Horace was a documentarian, and he had recently photographed a big meeting that took place at the Roundhouse between Stokely Carmichael and Allen Ginsberg. And I think it was there, we're imagining, that he learnt, because Stokely had come over from America, though he was a Trinidadian who was in America at the time, and he'd come to the Roundhouse to speak. And I think it was there that word got round that James Baldwin was coming over, because he was so vociferous in the US at that time, and things were heating up in London, you know, demos were happening. The mangrove where Horace spent a lot of his time was being attacked. Police were coming constantly to the mangroves. Things were heating up. So I think at that meeting, the Roundhouse meeting, which was called, what was it? The Dialectics and Liberation Congress, it was there that Horace learnt that James Baldwin was coming to town. At that time, Horace was taking photographs. This was one of the first films he shot. So we were talking about this, he had no equipment, he didn't have a crew. But there was an amazing centre in Kentish Town, the Interaction Centre, where Horace was able to get film equipment and galvanise a crew to get together and get down to the West Indian Centre to shoot this. Horace was a man who understood the importance of documenting what was going on, and he was active and passionate, and went down and shot this and made this incredible film that was shot, what year was it? This was 1967. Yeah. What more do you want? I don't know, I could go. It's quick, it's brief.
Honestly, Andrew, just to hear your voice and to see the connection, the blood connection, and to bookend the afternoon is a real honour. So
yeah,
thank
and
you.
it's really great to see an audience of this size coming to see this today. And thank you to the panel. It's been really fascinating to listen to.
Thank you very
so
much.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you as well for being a very kind of conscientious, listening and engaging audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.